$1,200 a month. Say that number out loud in most American cities, and people either laugh or wince, because they know exactly what that number buys you back home. A room in someone else's house, maybe. A studio apartment if you're lucky and the landlord's desperate. Not a life. Not really. I want to show you exactly what that same $1,200 bought me here in Mexico. Hour by hour, dollar by dollar, because I think most of the videos on this topic round the numbers up to make themselves sound impressive, and I'd rather just show you mine, unrounded, the good parts and the tight parts both. If you're new to this channel, subscribe, because every week I break down a real budget, not a highlight reel. My name is James Wilson. I'm 74 years old. I spent 33 years driving long-haul freight out of a terminal in Toledo, Ohio. The kind of job where you're gone 4 days out of every 7, and your body pays a toll nobody warns you about at 22 when you sign up for it. I never made big money. Trucking pays a living, not a fortune. And by the time I retired at 68, my Social Security check came to $1,340 a month. My late wife, Dorothy, passed 9 years ago, breast cancer, and after that $1,340 had to cover everything by itself. No second income to lean on. My rent in Toledo alone was running $875 a month for a one-bedroom that hadn't been updated since the Carter administration. By the time I paid utilities, insurance, and groceries, I had somewhere between $40 and $90 left over most months, depending on what broke that particular week. I want to be blunt about something. That's not retirement. That's just waiting carefully for something to go wrong that you can't afford. Dorothy and I were married 41 years before the cancer took her, and I won't pretend the last 8 months of that were anything but brutal, financially and every other way. We'd never been big savers. Truckers and their wives usually aren't. We lived month to month the way most working families do, and by the time I buried her, most of what we'd set aside had gone toward treatments insurance didn't fully cover. I have a son, Kevin, in Columbus, and a daughter, Patricia, out in Phoenix, and both of them, when I first mentioned Mexico, reacted about how you'd expect. Kevin asked me, straight out, if I'd lost my mind. Patricia was gentler about it, but no less skeptical. She kept asking what I'd do if something happened, and I couldn't get to a hospital in time. I didn't have a perfect answer for either of them. What I had was a spreadsheet, a stack of bank statements, and a growing certainty that staying in Toledo wasn't actually the safe option it looked like on paper. It just felt safe because it was familiar. Those aren't the same thing, and it took me almost a year of turning that over in my head before I was willing to admit it out loud. I found this channel niche the way a lot of you probably did. 3 in the morning, unable to sleep, falling down a hole of videos about Americans retiring overseas. Most of what I watched early on featured couples with $3,000 or $4,000 a month, and I'll admit that discouraged me for a while. I kept thinking, that's nice for them. But that's not my number. Then I found a handful of channels showing people living on far less, and I started doing real research instead of just watching. Here's the first hard truth I ran into. Mexico's temporary resident visa, the standard one most retirees use, requires proving around $4,400 a month in income, which I obviously didn't have. But there's a second path, proving roughly $74,000 in savings held steady for a full year instead. I had, after selling a paid-off truck and a life insurance payout from Dorothy that I'd never touched, just over $81,000 sitting in an account. That was my way in, not income. Savings, If you're watching this with a small pension and a modest nest egg like I had, that distinction matters more than almost anything else I'll tell you today. Getting the actual paperwork done was its own education. I applied for the visa sticker at the Mexican consulate in Chicago, which meant a 4-hour drive each way and a folder of bank statements thick enough that the consular officer flipped through it twice before she was satisfied. Once I landed in Mexico, I had 30 days to complete what's called the canje at the local immigration office, the process that exchanges the visa sticker in your passport for an actual residency card. I'll be honest, that appointment did not go smoothly the first time. I was missing a proof of address document I didn't know I needed, a simple utility bill in my name, and I had to reschedule 2 weeks out while my new landlord got the electric account transferred properly. It cost me nothing extra, just time and a fair amount of frustration standing in a waiting room with terrible air conditioning. But by month 2, I had the card in hand, and every year since has been a straightforward renewal instead of a fight. I picked Yucatan State for one specific reason. It's consistently ranked among the safest and most affordable regions in the country, and I wasn't interested in gambling on either of those things at 74. I looked hard at Mérida first, the way most people researching this area do, but Mérida's popularity has pushed rental prices up in the neighborhoods foreigners gravitate toward. So I looked 45 minutes north to a small port town on the Gulf Coast called Progreso, quieter, unglamorous in the best way, with a long Malecón, a working harbor, and a fraction of the foreign crowd you'd find in the touristy strips further south. I flew down for a scouting trip, stayed 9 days in a cheap guest house, and by day 4 I'd already found the apartment I ended up renting. Let me walk you through an actual day, because I think that tells you more than any spreadsheet could. I wake up around 5:30, old habit from decades of early freight schedules that never really left me. My apartment is a 1-bedroom, 2 blocks back from the Malecón, plain, clean ceiling fans instead of air conditioning, because I rarely need it this close to the water. Rent is $310 a month, utilities included in that figure except electricity, which runs me another $18 to $25 depending on the season. I make coffee on my own stove, because instant coffee is one American habit I never could shake, and I'm out the door by 6:15 to walk the Malecón while it's still cool. Breakfast most mornings comes from a cart 2 streets over, a woman named Doa Elvia, who's been selling tamales and coffee from the same corner for, by her own account, Mis de 20 años, more than 20 years. 2 tamales and a coffee runs me 45 pesos, which at the exchange rate that week worked out to a little under $2.50. I eat sitting on a low concrete wall facing the water, watching fishing boats come in, and I'll tell you honestly that 20 minutes most mornings does more for my mental health than anything a doctor back in Toledo ever prescribed me. Groceries are where the real savings live, and where I had to unlearn some American habits fast. The Mercado Municipal, the public market, sells produce, eggs, fresh fish, and dried goods at prices that made me genuinely laugh out loud the first few times I did the math. A kilo of tomatoes, about 2.2 lb, runs around 18 pesos, roughly $1. A whole fish, cleaned and scaled while I wait, might run me 60 to 80 pesos depending on the catch that day, somewhere between $3.50 and $4.50. I spend, on average, about $95 a month on groceries, cooking almost everything myself, which is a skill Dorothy always handled and I had to relearn from scratch at 69 with a lot of burned rice along the way. Healthcare was the piece that kept me up at night before I moved, and I want to give you real numbers instead of vague reassurance. Once I had my temporary resident card, I enrolled in IMSS, Mexico's public health system, on a voluntary basis. At my age, 74, that annual premium runs a little over $300 a year, paid as one lump sum at the local office, not monthly. That's not nothing on a $1,200 budget. But spread across 12 months, it's about $26. It doesn't cover everything. Dental and vision are out of pocket, and there are waiting periods for non-emergency specialists that would frustrate anybody used to American convenience. But last year, when I needed gallbladder surgery, IMSS covered it, start to finish, and my out-of-pocket cost came to under $200 total, mostly for medications the pharmacy didn't stock that week. In Toledo, on my old insurance, that same surgery would have cost me thousands before I ever saw a bill marked your responsibility. I won't pretend that experience was smooth in the way private care back home would have been. I waited 11 days for the surgery once it was scheduled, sitting with pain I was managing on over-the-counter medication the whole time, and every single form I filled out was in Spanish, which meant leaning hard on a young pharmacist near my building named Lupita, who translated 3 separate documents for the price of nothing more than my genuine gratitude. But I came out the other side of that surgery with my savings almost entirely intact, and that is not a sentence I could have written about myself at any point in the last 15 years of my life back in Ohio. By early afternoon, I've usually finished whatever errands the day required, and this is where I want to be honest about the parts of this life that aren't glamorous. I don't own a car. I sold the truck, remember, and I never replaced it with anything. Because between walking, the local combis, which are shared vans that run fixed routes for about 12 pesos a ride, and the occasional taxi for around 40 to 60 pesos, I simply don't need one. That's a real trade-off, not a virtue I'm claiming. I should also mention the season most of these budget videos skip over entirely. Progresso sits on the Gulf, and from roughly June through October, that means real hurricane risk, not just heavy rain. My second year here, a storm system came close enough that the town issued an evacuation advisory, and I spent 3 nights at Rosalba's inland house, sleeping on a fold-out cot, listening to wind I'd never heard the likes of back in Ohio. Nothing hit us directly, but it was a real reminder that a $310 apartment 2 blocks from the water comes with a trade-off beyond just money. I keep a small emergency bag packed from June through November now, cash, document copies, a week of medication. There are also days I miss having my own vehicle, especially when I want to see something outside Progresso on my own schedule. I also don't have a housekeeper or a gardener, the kind of household help other retirees mention constantly in these videos. My apartment is small enough that I clean it myself in about 20 minutes, and after 33 years on the road, that feels less like a limitation and more like a relief. Most afternoons I spend an hour with a Spanish tutor named Rosalba, a retired schoolteacher who charges me 100 pesos a session, about $6, and who has more patience for my mangled verb conjugations than any classroom teacher had for me at 16. I'm not going to claim fluency. I can hold a real conversation now, order anything I need, argue politely about the price of a taxi, and follow most of what's said around a dinner table, but I still reach for my phone's translator a few times a week, and I've made my peace with that. Rosalba became something more than a tutor without either of us really deciding it on purpose. She invites me to her family's Sunday meals now, a rotating cast of grandchildren and in-laws I only half keep straight, and I've started bringing a dish, usually something simple, because showing up empty-handed felt wrong to me the second time and unbearable by the third. Those Sunday meals don't show up anywhere on my $1,200 budget, because Rosalba's family won't let me pay for anything beyond the groceries I bring, and that, more than any of the numbers I've given you, is the part of this life I genuinely didn't see coming. Comment down below what your number is, whatever it is, because I know a lot of you watching are doing this math in your own heads right now and wondering if it adds up for you too. Dinner is usually simple. Rice, beans, whatever fish or chicken I picked up that morning, sometimes a plate from one of the small family-run Commodores near my building, where a full meal runs 55 to 70 pesos, about $3 to $4. Twice a month, as a deliberate small luxury, I let myself go to an actual sit-down restaurant on the Malican with tablecloths and a menu in 2 languages, order a proper plate of fresh ceviche and a cold beer, and that whole meal, tip included, comes to around $9. In Toledo, that same evening out, if I could have afforded it at all, would have run me closer to $35. Here's my full monthly breakdown, as close to exact as I can get it. Rent, $310, electricity, average $22, IMPS, spread monthly, $26, groceries, $95, transportation, about $30, phone and internet combined, $28, dining out and small treats, roughly $70. That comes to $581 in fixed and semi-fixed costs, which leaves me real breathing room out of that $1,200 room I use for emergencies, for a bus trip to Mérida when I want a change of scenery, and for actually saving a little each month for the first time since Dorothy got sick. What I didn't expect, and this is the part that surprised me more than any dollar figure, is what that breathing room did to my mind. Back in Toledo, with $40 of slack a month, every single decision carried weight. A car repair meant skipping something else. A dentist visit meant a month of rice and eggs. Here, on a budget that would sound like poverty to most people back home, I have actual margin for the first time in years, and margin, it turns out, is worth more than almost anything money buys directly. I'm not wealthy here. I want to be clear about that. I'm still careful. I still check prices, still skip the imported cereal aisle at the bigger supermarket because it's priced for tourists, not for me. But careful is a completely different feeling than desperate, and I lived in desperate for longer than I want to admit. There's a moment, about 4 months after I arrived, that I think about often. I was sitting on that same low concrete wall with my coffee and tamales, and an older Mexican man, Don Fernando, who I'd nodded to most mornings without ever really talking, sat down next to me uninvited and asked, in slow, careful English, how an American ends up eating breakfast on a wall in Progreso every single day. I told him the truth. Trucking, a wife I lost, a social security check that couldn't keep up with rent back home. He listened, nodded, and then said something that stuck with me since. He said, "Aku con poco se vive bien." Here, with little, one lives well. I didn't have a clever response to that. I just agreed with him, and I've thought about that sentence probably once a week ever since, because it's the truest single description of what this move actually gave me. Kevin came to visit last spring, the son who'd asked me straight out if I'd lost my mind. He stayed 5 days, slept on a cot in my small living room because I don't have a guest bedroom to offer him, and by the 3rd morning he was walking the Malican with me at 6:15 without being asked twice. On his last night, we sat outside with 2 beers that cost me, combined, less than a single domestic beer would have cost him at the airport bar he'd flown out of. He didn't say much. Kevin's never been a big talker, but before he left for the airport the next morning, he hugged me longer than he usually does and said, "Dad, I get it now." I didn't push him to explain further. I didn't need to. I'm not going to pretend $1,200 a month buys you the version of retirement they show in the glossy channels, the beachfront infinity pool, the weekly massage, the new car every few years. It doesn't, and if that's the life you're chasing, you'll need a bigger number than mine. And that's fine, that's a real and valid thing to want. What I can tell you is what it bought a 74-year-old former truck driver with a modest social security check and a savings account that would have barely covered a single serious illness back in Ohio. It bought mornings on a concrete wall with tamales and coffee. It bought a Spanish tutor who became something closer to family. It bought a gallbladder surgery that didn't touch my savings, and a son who finally understood, standing on a Malacan instead of hearing it second-hand over the phone. But if what you actually need is dignity, safety, decent food, real health care, and enough left over each month that you're not lying awake doing math at 3:00 in the morning, I'm here to tell you that number exists. And for me, it turned out to be a lot smaller than I ever thought possible sitting in that apartment in Toledo. It bought me a life. Not a big one, just an actual one, at last. I'm James Wilson. Thank you for listening to Retired in Mexico.